David and Sarah Thompson had lived at 32 Camden Square for 8 years. They were the kind of neighbors who kept to themselves, paid their mortgage on time, and complained only when absolutely necessary. Their terraced house shared a wall with number 30, and for most of those 8 years, that wall had been blissfully quiet. Then Amy Winehouse moved in next door. It started in the spring of 2007. The Thompsons first noticed the removalists, then the constant stream of visitors at odd hours. Taxis arriving at 3 a.m., people shouting in the street, music floating through the walls at volumes that made their wedding photos rattle on the mantelpiece. "It's just a phase," Sarah told her husband after the third sleepless night in a row. "She's young. She's famous. She'll settle down." But Amy didn't settle down. The noise wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was worse when it was quiet. David would lie in bed, listening to the soft thump of footsteps pacing back and forth, for hours. The floorboards in these old Camden houses were thin, and sound traveled like water finding cracks. At first, the pacing followed a pattern. 14 steps from the front window to the back wall. A pause. Then 14 steps back. David had counted them so many times he could predict when each footfall would hit the squeaky board near what he assumed was Amy's bedroom door. But as weeks passed, the pacing became erratic. Sometimes Amy would stop mid-step, as if someone had called her name. She would stand perfectly still for minutes at a time. David could feel the weight of her presence through the wall, motionless but somehow heavy with intention. Sarah noticed that Amy's pacing often synchronized with their own movements. When David got up for water at night, Amy's footsteps would start. When Sarah went to the bathroom, Amy would begin her restless walk. It was as if their neighbor was tracking their rhythms, learning their habits, mirroring their insomnia. "She's just a light sleeper like us," Sarah rationalized. "Old houses make noise." But David wasn't convinced. Sometimes he would test it, deliberately getting up at unusual hours, walking to the kitchen for no reason. And sure enough, within minutes, Amy's footsteps would begin. 14 steps. Pause. 14 steps back. The pattern was becoming a prison for all of them. Then came the singing. It began around 2 a.m. most nights. Not the polished Amy Winehouse voice that the world knew from radio and television. This was different. Raw. Unfiltered. Like hearing someone's private conversation with their own pain. Sarah heard it first. She nudged David awake on a Tuesday night in June, whispering, "Do you hear that?" Through the bedroom wall came Amy's voice, soft but clear, singing Valerie. But she wasn't singing it like the recorded version. She was singing it slowly, conversationally, as if Steve Winwood himself was sitting in the room with her. "Why don't you come on over, Valerie?" Amy's voice drifted through the plaster and brick. But then she paused as if waiting for an answer, as if someone had actually responded. David pressed his ear to the wall. The house next door was completely dark. No lights in any windows. But Amy was definitely talking to someone. "I know you miss me," Amy continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can see you standing there." Sarah grabbed David's arm. They both listened, holding their breath. Amy's voice was so close it felt like she was in their bedroom. "Why won't you answer me, Valerie?" A long pause. Then Amy started crying, not sobbing, just the soft, rhythmic sound of tears falling. Then she began singing again, but the words were different now. "Valerie, can you hear me from where you are? Valerie, are you watching me fall apart?" This went on for 20 minutes. Amy singing to someone who wasn't there, waiting for responses that never came, creating conversations with silence. The next morning, David knocked on Amy's door. He waited 5 minutes, but no one answered. He could hear movement inside, but the door remained closed. "Maybe we should talk to someone," Sarah suggested when David returned empty-handed. "The landlord, or—" "Talk to who about what?" David replied. "She's not breaking any laws. She's just singing." But it wasn't just singing, and they both knew it. The pattern established itself over the following weeks. Daytime silence from next door. Then, usually between 2 and 4 a.m., Amy's voice would seep through the wall. Always the same conversational tone. Always singing to people who weren't there. Some nights it was Valerie. Other nights it was Back to Black, but sung like a lullaby to an invisible companion. "We only said goodbye with words. Amy would whisper into the darkness. I died 100 times. Then she would pause as if listening to a response. I know you did too, she would continue. I can feel it. But the most disturbing nights were when Amy sang songs that didn't exist. She would hum melodies that neither David nor Sarah recognized, weaving lyrics that seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. I'm waiting by the window. Can you see me there? Amy would sing to her invisible audience. I'm wearing the dress you liked, the blue one with the tears. These improvised songs were always addressed to someone specific. Sometimes it was Blake. Sometimes it was her grandmother Cynthia, who had died years earlier. Once Sarah was certain she heard Amy singing to her own reflection. Mirror me, show me what I used to be, Amy had whispered in the early hours of a Wednesday morning. When did I become this ghost of what I'll never be? The Thompsons found themselves documenting these nocturnal performances. Sarah started keeping a notebook by her bedside, writing down fragments of Amy's midnight confessions. She told herself it was evidence, something to show the landlord or the police if things got worse. But really she was becoming drawn to Amy's pain, captivated by the raw honesty that only emerged in darkness. David worried about Sarah's growing obsession. He would find her sitting by the shared wall, notebook in hand, waiting for Amy's voice to begin. Sometimes Sarah would press a glass against the wall to hear more clearly, her eyes closed in concentration, transcribing words that were never meant to be heard. This isn't healthy, David told his wife after finding her asleep against the wall, notebook open in her lap. We're becoming voyeurs to someone's breakdown. She wants to be heard, Sarah replied. Otherwise, why sing loud enough for us to hear? The Thompsons started sleeping in the guest room at the back of the house, but even there they could hear her. The sound seemed to travel through the very bones of the building. One night in August, David couldn't sleep. He made himself a cup of tea and sat in the living room, reading by lamplight. Around 3 a.m., Amy's voice started again. This time she was singing, Love is a Losing Game. But she wasn't alone. David heard it clearly through the shared wall. Amy was harmonizing, with herself, two distinct vocal lines, as if two Amy Winehouses were sitting in that room, singing together. He set down his book and listened more carefully. It was impossible, but he was hearing it. Amy's voice in perfect harmony with Amy's voice. A duet with no second person. Love is a losing game, both voices sang together. One Amy singing melody, the other singing harmony, their voices interweaving like they were reading each other's minds. David pressed his ear against the wall. The voices were coming from different parts of the room. One Amy near the window, based on the sound. The other Amy closer to the shared wall. Two distinct positions, two distinct voices, one person. What made it more unsettling was the conversation happening between the voices. During instrumental breaks that didn't exist in the original song, the two Amys would talk to each other. Do you remember when we were happy? The first voice would ask. Before Blake? The second voice would reply. Or before we knew what happiness could cost? Before we learned that love was just another word for slow suicide? Sing it again, the second voice would plead. Maybe this time it won't hurt so much. And they would sing the same verse over and over, each repetition more desperate than the last, as if repetition could change the outcome, could rewrite history through sheer vocal will. David found himself timing these conversations, measuring the spaces between questions and answers. The pauses were too long for one person to be switching between voices. They were the natural rhythms of two people talking, not the artificial gaps of someone talking to themselves. But there was only one person in that room. He was certain of it because he had started watching Amy's house during the day. From his upstairs window, he could see directly into Amy's front yard and entrance. No one came. No one went. The curtains remained drawn. The only signs of life were the milk bottles accumulating on the doorstep and the occasional shadow passing by an upstairs window. Yet every night, there were multiple voices coming from that house. The next morning, Sarah found David making breakfast with shaking hands. What's wrong? She asked. I think we need to move, David said quietly. Move? We've lived here for 8 years. I don't think Amy's alone over there. What do you mean? David looked at his wife, trying to find words for what he'd experienced. I mean, I think she's got company, but I don't think they're Alive. Sarah stared at him. David, that's ridiculous. Is it? When was the last time you saw anyone go into that house? When was the last time you saw Amy leave? Sarah thought about it. The constant stream of visitors had stopped weeks ago. The taxis had stopped coming, but the singing continued every night. Maybe she's just practicing, Sarah offered, recording herself and playing it back. But they both knew that wasn't what they were hearing. The breaking point came on a Thursday night in September. David and Sarah were both lying awake, listening to Amy sing Tears Dry on Their Own. But tonight she wasn't just conversing with invisible companions. She was arguing with them. The argument had been building for weeks. The Thompsons had noticed that Amy's nighttime conversations were becoming more heated, more desperate. She would plead with her invisible companions, beg them to stay, to understand, to forgive. Tonight was different. Tonight, Amy was angry. I know what you're going to say. Amy's voice came through the wall, sharp and defensive. But you don't understand what it's like. A pause that stretched for nearly a minute. David could hear Amy pacing, her footsteps sharp and agitated. Stop looking at me like that, Amy continued. I'm doing my best. Another pause. But this time, David could swear he heard something else. A whisper. So faint it might have been the wind, or the house settling, or his own imagination desperate to make sense of the impossible. I can't just stop. You know I can't just stop. The whisper came again, clearer this time. David grabbed Sarah's arm, but she was already sitting up, her face pale in the darkness. Then Amy's voice changed. It became deeper, more masculine. It became Blake's voice. You're killing yourself, Amy? Blake's voice said from Amy's throat. Sarah's grip on David's arm tightened. They both recognized the voice from interviews they'd seen on television, from the few times they'd glimpsed Blake visiting before the breakup. I'm already dead, Amy replied in her own voice. We both are. Then let's be dead together, Blake's voice answered. But this time, when Blake's voice spoke, it came from a different part of the room. Amy was somehow projecting Blake's voice to a different location, creating the acoustic illusion of two people in conversation. The technical impossibility of what they were witnessing made it more frightening, not less. This wasn't just grief-induced hallucination. This was something that defied the laws of sound and space. You left me, Amy's voice accused from her usual position near the shared wall. You pushed me away, Blake's voice replied from near the window. Because you were destroying me. Because I was destroying myself. The conversation continued for over an hour. Amy and Blake rehashing their relationship, relitigating every fight, every betrayal, every moment of love and hate that had defined their time together. But Blake was responding with information Amy shouldn't have known, perspectives she couldn't have had access to. Sarah sat up in bed, gripping the sheets. David, are you hearing this? David was already reaching for his phone. I'm calling the police. And telling them what? That our neighbor's having imaginary conversations? But even as Sarah spoke, they both knew this wasn't imagination. The conversation was too complex, too nuanced, too filled with information that Amy couldn't have possessed about Blake's thoughts and experiences. Through the wall, Amy was now singing a duet with Blake's voice. Back to Black, performed by Amy Winehouse and the vocal ghost of Blake Fielder Civil. Two voices, one throat, harmonizing perfectly in the darkness. We only said goodbye with words, Amy sang. I died 100 times, Blake's voice replied. You left me here alone, they sang together. David put down his phone. What was he going to tell the police? That Amy Winehouse was channeling her ex-husband's voice? That she was having conversations with people who weren't there? That their shared wall had become a conduit for something that shouldn't exist? The singing continued until dawn. Amy and Blake, having conversations, singing duets, arguing, reconciling, existing together in a space where only one person should have been. By morning, David and Sarah had made their decision. They put the house on the market the following week. When the estate agent asked why they were selling, Sarah simply said, "We need a change of scene." The house sold quickly, below market value. The Thompsons didn't care about the money. They cared about sleep, about sanity, about the difference between the living and the dead. On their last night in Camden Square, as they packed the final boxes, Amy's voice drifted through the wall one last time. "Goodbye, neighbors," she sang softly. "Thanks for listening." A pause. "They were good listeners," Blake's voice added. "Better than most." "Yes," Amy replied. "They heard us when no one else would." David and Sarah looked at each other across their empty living room. Amy had known they were listening. All along she had known. They loaded their car in silence and drove away from Camden Square at sunrise. In the rearview mirror, David caught a glimpse of number 30. Every window was dark, but he could swear he saw two figures standing at the upstairs window, watching them leave. 3 months later, Amy Winehouse was found dead in that same house. The news reports mentioned the empty bottles, the final struggles with addiction, the tragic end of a brilliant career. They didn't mention the neighbors who had moved away. They didn't mention the conversations with invisible companions. They didn't mention the duets with ghosts. But David and Sarah read the news from their new home 50 miles away, and they understood what the papers didn't. Amy hadn't been alone in those final months. She had been accompanied by every person she'd ever lost, every relationship that had ended, every part of herself that had died before her body finally followed. The coroner's report mentioned acute alcohol poisoning. The media focused on the tragic waste of talent, the familiar narrative of addiction claiming another brilliant artist. But the Thompsons knew there was more to the story. In the weeks following Amy's death, they received calls from other former neighbors on Camden Square. Mrs. Peterson from number 28 mentioned hearing voices from Amy's house when she walked her dog at night. The student in number 34 described similar nocturnal conversations drifting from Amy's windows. Everyone had heard something. No one had spoken about it until after Amy died. "We all thought we were going mad," Mrs. Peterson confided during one phone call. "Hearing voices, conversations, people who couldn't possibly be there." The student had recorded some of the sounds on his phone, thinking he might sell them to a tabloid. But when he played the recordings back, there was only silence. Whatever they had been hearing, whatever impossible acoustic phenomenon had been occurring in that Camden house, it hadn't translated to digital recording. David and Sarah realized they had been witnesses to something that existed in the spaces between life and death, in the thin places where grief becomes presence, where longing creates its own reality. The wall between the living and the dead had been thin in that Camden house. Amy had been living on both sides of it for months before anyone realized she'd already crossed over. Years later, when people asked why they'd moved so suddenly from Camden, Sarah would just say, "We couldn't sleep." She never mentioned the singing, the conversations, the impossible harmonies in the darkness. Some sounds are too private to share. Some truths are too fragile to speak aloud. But on quiet nights in their new house, with its thick walls and peaceful neighbors, David and Sarah sometimes heard echoes. Amy's voice, soft and distant, still singing to companions that only she could see. They never spoke about these eerie moments, but they both knew they would carry Amy's haunting midnight songs forever.